to the Winning Agenda's coverage of Flesh and Blood. My name's Jesse Marshall, and I'm here with a deck tech on what is undoubtedly one of the most powerful classic constructed decks in the format at the moment. One that's a blast to play. It might take a fair bit of mental energy sometimes to calculate, given the many possibilities you have, but it is, of course, Chane bound by Shadow. So we're going to start by just taking a quick look at Chane and their hero ability. So Chane bound by Shadow, 4 intelligence, meaning they draw 4 cards at the end of each turn, 40 life. It's got a once per turn action, create a Soul Shackle token. Your next Rune Blade or Shadow action this turn gains Go Again, and it has Go Again itself. It's a Shadow Rune Blade hero, and of course from Monarch onwards, what we're seeing is, in addition to the class being Rune Blade, we also have a talent being Shadow. So Chane is able to play cards from the Runeblade card pool as well as cards from the Shadow card pool. And as you'll see as we go through the deck, there are also a range of cards which are specifically Shadow Runeblade cards, which only Chane can play at the moment. So what does this ability actually do? A Soul Shackle is an aura that Chane creates each turn with their ability. So auras stay in the arena, as Soul Shackle notes, and it says at the beginning of your action phase, banish the top card of your deck. So each turn, you can give one of your action cards, that is a Rune Blade or a Shadow action, Go Again. It doesn't even have to be a card, it can be a weapon. So your next Rune Blade or Shadow action this turn gains Go Again. You create a Soul Shackle token, and then your Soul Shackle tokens stack up. So on turn 1, you create one, you give something Go Again. Turn 2, you create another one, give something else Go Again. Turn 3, you create another one, give something else Go Again. And each turn, at the beginning of your action phase, you're banishing the top card of your deck for each Soul Shackle in play. So once you have 5 or 6 Soul Shackles in play on turn 5 or 6, because with this deck you want to be creating one every turn, then you're banishing the top 5 or 6 cards from the top of your deck at the start of your turn. So why would you want to do that? You're going to run out of cards in deck if you're banishing your cards too quickly. And as we know, once you run out of cards in your deck in Flesh and Blood, you can become exhausted, which means you no longer have things to do. You no longer have cards to pitch for resources, and you no longer have cards to play. Chane does flirt with the line of becoming exhausted. You'll often end games with no cards left in your deck, or very few cards left in your deck, but the hope is that on that last turn, when you banish 7 or 8 cards from the top of your deck because you've got 7 or 8 Soul Shackles, you'll actually be able to kill your opponent. How do you do that? You do that because you've got a range of these cards in your deck which have the ability Blood Debt. And Blood Debt says, at the beginning of your end phase, if Riftbind, this card here, is in your banish zone, you lose 1 life. However, Riftbind has another ability which says you may play Riftbind from your banish zone, and if you do, it gains plus X strength, where X is the number of non-attack action cards you played this turn. So cards like Riftbind and all the other Blood Debt cards, which I'll note and come to in a moment, can be played from your banish zone, which means when you banish 7 or 8 of them at the start of your turn, they actually function as an additional card in hand. So if you've got 7 or 8 additional cards in hand, you can imagine that that gives you some capacity to have some pretty crazy turns. So the thing you have to balance when you're designing a Chane deck is having enough Blood Debt cards so that when you randomly banish cards from the top of your deck each turn, you're hopefully banishing a significant proportion of Blood Debt cards, ideally at least half. But you also need to make sure that you've got enough non-attack actions in your deck for a couple of reasons. One is that cards like Bounding Demigon and Unhallowed Rights, which are 2 of your Blood Debt cards, they're both attack actions that can be played from the banish zone. They have this restriction that if you've played a non-attack action card, you may play them from your banish zone. So Unhallowed Rights and Bounding Demigon are more economically efficient than a lot of the other Blood Debt options which we're not playing in this deck, like Piercing Shadow Vise, and even other Colors of Rip Through Reality. But they come with this restriction of you needing to have enough non-attack actions in your deck. The benefit that you get from non-attack actions is not only to play these cheaper Blood Debt cards, but also to buff your Riftbinds. So as you would have seen from that ability I described on Riftbind there, when you play it from your banish zone, it gets plus X, where X is the number of non-attack action cards you've played this turn. So if you've played 7 or 8 non-attack actions, then your Riftbind is getting plus 7 or 8. Now, for our more experienced viewers who've been kind of keeping an eye on the metagame, you would have noticed that a lot of people are playing Snag, which is a generic instant that says attack action cards can't gain strength from their own abilities or from the abilities of attack reactions, which means that Riftbind's ability doesn't actually add strength to itself. So you can't... There is this card floating around in the metagame, which a lot of people are sideboarding in against Chane, which does negate somewhat the ability of Riftbind. Now, you could say that Snag is really only good against multiple Riftbind turns, because on the first Riftbind, let's say you've played 3 or 4 non-attack actions that turn. If they play a Snag, they're really only preventing 3 or 4 damage, which is really just kind of an average block, or an average defense reaction, if you like. If you've played 2 or 3 Riftbinds that turn, though, then they might be blocking 2 or 3 times that much damage, so 9 or 12 damage, which becomes quite a lot. So you can't go all in on just your Riftbinds and their ability, giving you the ability to get over the top of your opponent. You also need to be making sure that you've got enough go-agains, which is where a lot of these other non-attack actions come into play. So we've already got the natural ability to give our attacks go-again from... I didn't get that. We've already got the ability to give our attacks go again naturally from Chane's ability to create Soul Shackles, but 2 attacks each turn is probably not going to be enough. When we're banishing 7 or 8 cards from the top of our deck in the endgame, we want to be designing our deck so that we have the capacity to attack 3, 4, even 5 times in a turn. How do we do that? We have a few non-attack actions over here. We've got Morven Skies, which gives the next Runeblade attack action card we play go again, and gives it the ability to, if it hits, create a rune chant. And Morven Skies itself has go again. So that's one card when you have it in your hand. We only play the blues, because as we'll come to in a moment, this deck can be quite resource intensive, and where possible you want to play as many blues as possible. And make sure at least that you're spreading your resource curve so that your reds are your impactful kill cards, and your enablers, things like Morven Skies. The difference between the blue and the red is just the number of rune chant tokens it creates if it hits. That's not enough of a bonus for us to play the reds over the blues. So anyway, Morven Skies and Shadow Puppetry both give our attacks go again. Gorganian Tome is just a draw a card, basically. It cycles, it's a cantrip, but it has go again, which means that you can't pitch it for resources, which is one downside, and it doesn't block, but it is basically a free attack action, in inverted commas if you like, in that it doesn't cost any resources and it doesn't really cost an action point because it has go again and it cycles itself. Why is that useful? It's useful for the aforementioned, we can play Unhallowed Rights or banning Demigon after playing the Gorganian Tome, and it buffs our Riftbinds for 1 when we play them from the Banish Zone. Plunder Run is another non-attack action that we're playing quite a few of, and the reason we're playing 6, so the reds do give you the bonus of +3 to your next attack when you play them from Arsenal, which is really just a great attack aggressive card. So the next time an attack action card you control hits this turn, you draw a card, is 1 bonus. And the second one is if it's played from Arsenal, the next attack action card you play this turn gains +3 strength. Drawing cards is really important in this deck, as is the fact that Plunder Run's ability to draw a card. It doesn't just apply to the next attack action, it applies for the rest of the turn. And since we're usually playing 2, 3, perhaps 4, maybe even 5 attack actions a turn, it's even more likely than in most decks that we're going to actually get to draw that card off Plunder Run. And when we do draw the card off Plunder Run, so many of our cards are impactful. They're either additional resources to allow us to go even deeper on our turn, or they're another Morven Skies, Shadow Puppetry, or something else to give us another attack. So your opponent really has this difficult calculus when you play a red Plunder Run, particularly from Arsenal with the bonus strength, of thinking about whether they can block out every attack on your turn, which is usually going to require them to dedicate their whole hand. And if they do that, then you've time walked anyway, and you're not going to be taking any damage on the backswing. But if they only commit some of their hand, then perhaps they're making a lower value block in the hope that you won't have enough follow-up to then draw a card off the Plunder Run. And if you do then draw a card off the Plunder Run anyway, that's a bit of a blowout, with another attack, that is. So Plunder Run red is really great. Plunder Run blue is really good because it still gives you that ability to draw a card if any of your attacks hit this turn. It only gives a +1 bonus if it's played from Arsenal, but if you draw them in the early game, you can either play it just for the draw a card ability, or you can pitch it, which is fine because it's a blue and it helps to fuel your early turns. So having it in the deck isn't as much of an opportunity cost. So those are our non-blood debt, non-attack actions, and I've divided these into columns. So we've got the non-blood debt non-attack actions, we've got the blood debt non-attack actions. So all of these cards in this column can be played from the Banish Zone. We've then got the non-blood debt, attack actions and instants. So none of these cards can be played from the banished zone except for Eclipse, but that has a restriction. It doesn't have blood debt, but you can only play it. It's the Chane specialization. It's the legendary. You can only play it if you've played 6 or more cards with blood debt this turn, and if you have, you can play it from your banished zone. And it creates an Ursa the Soul Reaper token, which is an ally who attacks for 6 for 0 resources, and it attacks a hero with cards in their soul, it gains Go Again. So Ursa is a really nice way in the late game, as you're running out of cards perhaps, because you've got 6 or 7 soul shackles and you haven't got many cards left in your deck, you've still got a really powerful attack that you can be making for 0 to just keep the pressure on and hopefully get you over the top. So Eclipse can be played from the banished zone, but it doesn't have blood debt as such. The rest of these cards are, attack actions in Enlightened Strike, and Soul Reaping's our other Chane specialization. It's also legendary, so we can only have 1 in the deck, and it's just an extremely efficient attack. So you can banish 1 or more cards rather than pay its cost, and if you do, you gain 1 resource for each card with blood debt that you banish this way. So if you banish 2 blood debt cards, say 2 Riftbinds, to pay Soul Reaping's resource cost, you actually gain 2 resources. Soul Reaping doesn't cost you anything to play, and while it's attacking a hero with 1 or more card in their soul, it has Go Again, which is pretty great. So obviously against Bolton or Prism at the moment, those light heroes that get cards in their soul, it can naturally have Go Again, but otherwise it can just be a free 6 cost attack. It's actually better than free because it can actually generate your resources and get your Riftbinds and other things into the banished zone where they have more impactful effects. So Soul Reaping's a great card, Eclipse a great card, there are specializations, and then we've got Art of War, which for anyone who's been watching along with Chane as it's developed in the metagame, would have noticed that this card has just been an absolute all-star. So the variance with Art of War is whether you draw it or whether you banish it off the top of your deck. If you draw them, you're always happy to see them at any time in the game because they just give you a much more highly impactful turn than you otherwise would have had. But if you don't draw them and you banish them all, or c'est la vie, these things happen. So what Art of War says is it's an instant, so it can't block, which is the one downside. It costs 1 and it pitches for 2. You rarely ever pitch this. It says choose 2. Attack action cards you control gain +1 strength and +1 defense this turn. The next attack action card you play this turn gains Go Again. Until end of turn, you may defend with attack action cards from Arsenal, or you may banish an attack action card from your hand if you do draw 2 cards. So you generally choose that last option to banish a blood debt attack action from your hand and draw 2 cards, because then basically if you banish a Riftbind, it's still available for you to play. So you haven't actually lost a card from hand, but then you get to draw 2 fresh cards. So it's great card advantage. And you can also, in addition to doing that, either give +1 strength to all your attacks for the rest of the turn, attack action cards I should say, or the next attack action card you play this turn gains Go Again. So this can also function like those non-attack actions, like the Morven Skies and the Shadow Puppetry, to give you an extra attack on one of your key turns, as well as giving you the cards that are going to turn into those attacks. So Art of War is just an all-around standout and can help you to go from a 2-attack turn to a 3 or even a 4-attack turn. So to take a step back then to these blood debt non-attack actions, Seeds of Agony is the only card that we're playing 9 of, because it's just so powerful and just so central to the strategy. So it's a non-attack action with blood debt, so we can play it from the banished zone. And it says, the next attack action card with cost 2 or less you play this turn gains deal 1 arcane damage to target hero, Go Again. So that's the red. The yellow is the next attack action card with cost 1 or less, and the blue only triggers off attack action cards with cost 0 or less to deal the arcane damage. So what Seeds of Agony does is it allows you to add basically this little arcane damage trigger to your next attack, but it also is a non-attack action that stacks up for Riftbind. So we'll come to pitching in a moment and the kind of strategy of how to get these cards onto the bottom of your deck. But if in the late game, part of the object of this deck is to get sort of 6 or 7 Seeds of Agony onto the bottom of your deck, so that on your last big blood debt turn, you're banishing 6, 7 Seeds of Agony, even 5, and then adding those triggers to your attacks, but also adding the non-attack actions played that turn to your Riftbind. And because they cost 0 and they have Go Again, once they're in the banished zone, you can just play them out for free. Doesn't take your action point, doesn't take any resources. So they're basically just little bonuses. The downside of Seeds of Agony, it blocks for 2, which is not ideal, but it also is not super impactful card on its own. Like if you compare Seeds of Agony with Shadow Puppetry, Shadow Puppetry is obviously a much better card for the same cost and the same pitch value. But Seeds of Agony having Blood Debt and being able to be stacked up and played off your Soul Shackle banishes later in the game is really where its power comes from. Howl from Beyond is the other Blood Debt non-attack action that we're playing 3 of. So we're playing the 3 reds. It's 2 resources to play. It gives your next attack action card plus 3 strength, and it has Go Again. So it's basically just a chunky buff to an attack action on the turn that you play it. It does cost 2, which is a little expensive, but the fact that it doesn't cost you a card because it's coming off from the banish zone is just fantastic. And that extra 3, 3 is actually quite a lot. That's a whole nother card from their hand potentially. Whilst the 2 can be a whole card from your hand in terms of pitch value, because we're playing so many blues, it actually allows us to get extra value off the Howl, because more often than not we can pitch a blue on our turn, which means Howl is actually part of a card. So we spend 2 from that blue to play the Howl, and then 1 to play a Riftbind later on, or 1 to play a Ghostly Visit or something else. So the number of blues that we play increases the value of Howl for us, in terms of it only being part of a card to play, while it's still usually an entire card from our opponent, unless they're playing, of course, defense reactions, in which case they can more efficiently block that attack. But still, the fact that Howl usually is going to be coming from the banish zone and therefore not cost us a card still means that we're in pretty good shape. In terms of the resource trade, Seeping Shadows is our last non-attack action that we play from the banish zone. So this one is a little more controversial because it costs 3. It's a little difficult, and it's almost always going to be a full blue card from our hand that we need to dedicate to playing the Seeping Shadows, which is not ideal. But the benefit of it is that it functions like Morven Skies, Shadow Puppetry, and Art of War in actually giving our next attack Go Again. And the ability to get that from the banish zone, so it's not actually costing us a card as such that we're playing. Admittedly, it costs resources, as we said. But the ability to get that from the banish zone, basically an extra action point, is just really, really crucial. We're only playing the 1. I could see playing 2, and I'll come later on to some of the variations and changes that you could make to this deck as well. There are lots of different Chane builds out there, but I really like having 1 Seeping Shadows in the deck so that at some point in the game you're going to banish it. You can leave it there for a couple of turns if you want. There's no problem with taking a bit of blood debt damage, and that's something else I'll touch on later. And just saving it up for that key turn when having that extra attack can just be absolutely crucial once you empty out your opponent's hand on those big turns. So that's our non-attack actions, and then our attack actions, and it's really important. All of these attack actions here have blood debt, so they can all be played from the banish zone. And it's important to have a solid chunk of cards like that in your deck so that your big turns, when you're banishing 6, 7, 8 cards off the top of your deck, actually have enough attack actions for you to get through your opponent's defenses and win the game, particularly if they're playing a more defensive build with lots of defense reactions and trying to turtle you out and fatigue you. So we've got a lot of reds in this area for that reason. The Shadow of Ursa, of course, is a majestic that's blue. I won't go through all of these in detail. I've already been through Riftbind, Bounty Demigon. It's a 0 cost. It gets +1 when you play from the banish zone. It can only be played if you played a non-attack action. Shadow of Ursa is really interesting. As an additional cost to play it, it's a 0 cost 2 attack action. As an additional cost to play it, you can banish a card with blood debt from your hand, and if you do, it gains Go Again. So it can set up some pretty big turns. If you play a Shadow of Ursa from the banish zone, banishing a Shadow of Ursa from your hand, for example, or a Seeds of Agony, or even another attack, it's just an extra little attack that you can get in on those turns. And that can be quite good, particularly in combination with Plunder Run. Shadow of Ursa and Plunder Run work really well together because this just proliferates the number of attacks you're having on those turns and makes it harder for them to block out and prevent you drawing a card. Sometimes the 2 attack is not great, but in the early game, I always recommend pitching Shadow of Ursas because if you can get 2 or 3 of them into your blood debt stack at the bottom that you're going to be banishing on the last couple of turns, it can be really, really powerful just to give you that little bit of extra damage on those last couple of turns. Unhallowed Rights is an important one because whilst it can only be played if you've played a non-attack action this turn from the banish zone, it puts a non-attack action card with blood debt from your graveyard back on the bottom of your deck. And what that means is that if you banish Seeds of Agony early, using your Soul Shackles with your random banishes, and you play them, you can actually recycle them with Unhallowed Rights, put them back on the bottom of your deck, so that when you get through to the bottom of your deck, you're actually hitting those 4, 5, 6 Seeds of Agony that you want to be. And that's a really important aspect of this deck, as I've touched on a few times, making sure that you stack your pitches so that you've got Seeds of Agony, perhaps Eclipse, because you're almost always going to be pitching this in the early game for its 3 resources, which is great, so that it comes back in the late game. And that's one that you really want in those late game pitch stacks. So Seeds of Agony, Eclipse, a couple of red Riftbinds. If you draw these early, just pitch them. No worries if they're red. You really want to get them to the bottom where they're going to be impactful. Shadow of Ursa, as I said, get that on the bottom. Bounding Demigon, again, no problem, get that on the bottom. Howl from Beyond, don't feel afraid to play it early. If you've got the resources, you've got the card, go ahead. You can recycle it with Unhallowed Rights as well, because it has Blood Debt, but it can also just help you to sort of have some more impactful early turns, no problem. But if you can pitch it and get at least 1 or 2, either pitch it or get it back with Unhallowed Rights, it can set up some really big turns on those later turns as well. So yeah, really think carefully about your pitch stacks. Make sure you're prioritizing getting Seeds, Riftbinds, Shadow of Ursas, Howl from Beyonds, and a Rip Through Reality into that last couple of turns. Because again, Rip Through Reality, which I'll touch on now, also allows you to get basically a free extra action point against most opponents on that last big turn, or that last couple of big turns. So Rip costs 2, so it's 2 for 4, which is not a great rate of return for an attack. Keeping in mind that we've got lots of more efficient attacks than that. Unhallowed Rights is a 1 for 4 with upside. So Rip Through Reality at 2 for 4 is not great, but it says if you've dealt arcane damage to an opposing hero this turn, it gains Go Again. And obviously that ability, as we've touched on a few times, to turn resources in hand into an extra action point in the midst of making an attack is just fantastic when you're trying to chain together as many different attacks as possible. So I'm playing 2 Rips just because of the resource cost. It can be a little bit intensive, but also because there are obviously opponents who have Arcane Barrier, equipment, or other ways to prevent arcane damage, where your Seeds may not be landing. Now, the idea is that at the end of the game, on the kind of final couple of turns, when you're banishing heaps of cards, hopefully lots of Seeds, and a couple of Riftbinds and other things, your opponent can't really afford to be pitching cards to prevent arcane damage, and hopefully they can't be at least preventing all your arcane damage. And if that's the case, and you have a Rip Through Reality sitting there in the banish zone, they're in this really tough spot where you might have played 5 Seeds, for example. They might have to pitch 2, maybe even 3 cards to prevent all of that, and then what are they going to do about the Riftbinds and the other attacks that you're coming in with? So Rip Through Reality really just presents a bit of a fork, augments the power of Seeds of Agony on those late turns, and punishes your opponent for not preventing all of your Blood Debt damage. In a similar way to what Plunder Run does with your attacks as well. Punishes them for not preventing all of your attack action card damage. Ghostly Visit is just a decent value Blood Debt attack. It's a 1 for 4, so better rate than the Rip Through Reality, as I mentioned. Same rate as Unhallowed Rights, but no upside, but no restriction. So it doesn't have the can only be played if you've played a non-attack action restriction, but it doesn't have any upside. So it's just a pretty vanilla 1 for 4 that can be played from the banish zone. So we really just have those in there so that we're increasing the odds with the way the deck's balanced, that on those last couple of turns we're going to have the cards that we need in the banish zone to make the kill. So I'll go over to talk about the sideboard, which is this section, and the equipment in a moment, but I just wanted to kind of touch on a couple of cards that you might elect to change, or that kind of different people have different views on. So I know that a lot of people out there don't like blue Bounding Demigons, so we're playing 3 red and 2 blue, and a lot of people don't like blue Riftbind, so we're playing 2 blue and then the 3 yellow and the 3 red. The reason I've got those blues of the Riftbinds and the Demigons in there is that this main deck is basically what I would play against Katsu. So this is kind of the starting 60 that you play against Katsu, and you want to have the right balance of, as I've divided these things up, Blood Debt cards that are non-attack actions, Blood Debt cards that are attack actions, so you're getting the right value off your banishes in the late game, and then your value cards, which are really premium and difficult slots to choose, which are your non-Blood Debt attack actions, non-attack actions, and instants. You also, in amongst all of that balance across those categories, need to make sure that you're balancing your resources properly so that you can afford to come in with Nebula Blade in the early game, for example. You can afford to spend a couple of cards blocking and still have an impactful turn that has up to 3 attacks. You can play your Howl from Beyonds when you want to and not be spending 2 reds or a yellow playing your Howl from Beyond, but instead spending 2/3 of a blue and then being able to spend the other resource on something else because we have so many cards that cost 1. So those are the sorts of reasons why having enough blue pitches in the deck is quite important. The blue Unhallowed Rights have that important function of bringing back the seeds and the howls, so I think that's enough to justify their inclusion. Riftbinds as well. If you pitch blue Riftbinds early, they can be reasonably impactful 4 or 5 strength attacks later, which is totally fine. Now, some people are playing Mutated Mass in that slot, and I just think blue Riftbind is better. Mutated Mass doesn't block very effectively. It doesn't attack for 4 or even 6 all that easily. And in the late game, there are actually very often going to be higher priorities that you have for your first, second, third, and even 4th attack action on your big turn. It's usually going to be Riftbinds, Unhallowed Rights, Ghostly Visits, Shadowverse doesn't really count, but other things that you're going to be wanting to play. Ideally, sort of 3 Riftbinds in a row is where you want to get to. And having Mutated Masses there doesn't really help that much. It often turns out to be no better than a Ghostly Visit. Whereas blue Riftbind can actually end up being the same, plus it blocks, plus it's more consistent, and it can do something in the early to mid game. So I just much prefer having Riftbind over the Mutated Mass. Blue Bounding Demigon, not an amazing card, one that I'll often sideboard out, but as I said, in this standard 60 versus Katsu, I'm perfectly happy to have that as just an extra attack that doesn't require resources, crucially, so that in the late game, on that final turn, if you do happen to have an extra go again, an extra action point sitting there, you're more likely to have a 0-cost card that you can play, because it does happen sometimes that you've got more attack actions than you do resources. And you just are like, well, there's nothing I can do with my final action. So having that blue Demigon sitting there might just be an extra couple of damage. That also triggers blue seeds, which is quite important as well. Because otherwise, if you don't play the blue Demigons or yellow Demigons, you've only got 3 attacks in your deck, 6 attacks, including the Shadow Ursa, that are going to trigger the blue seeds. So having 8 rather than 6 is much better. So that's the main deck. Those are a couple of the kind of more controversial choices. I've touched on Seeping Shadows. Some people don't like that card. Some people don't like the 3 Howls. I found them to be fantastic. Blue and red Plunder Run, I would strongly encourage keeping those 6, but you might have different views. And otherwise, I think everything's pretty standard. I've touched on why I like Rip from Reality as well. In terms of the sideboard, 3 Time Snap Potions are there for Arclight Sentinels and in the Prism matchup. You can bring them in other matchups if you like. You know, banking an action point to retrieve later in the game is totally fine, but I don't think they're better than any of the other blues that we're playing in the deck. Because pitching these early is worse than pitching a Bounding Demigon early. Playing these early is probably slightly better, but I think most of the time we've got to have some blues that we're pitching more regularly, and the Demigons definitely fall into that category, whereas the Plunder Runs and the Morven's Skies are cards that we'd rather play than pitch, if that makes sense. So the Time Snap's really good against Prism. That's pretty much mostly where I bring them in. Command and Conquer, very good against Prism in terms of popping their Phantasms, but also just being a good way to get cards out of their soul. Totally fine against Bolton as well if you think or know that they might be on a Luminor Ascension combo build. But even then, I kind of think that, which I'll touch on in a moment, there are other ways that you can beat that. And Dread Scythe is actually a card we've got specifically in there for the Luminor Ascension combo build. So I'll come to that in a second. So Command and Conquer, I'm actually bringing in a lot less than I was initially. I really only bring this in now against Prism. But I can see you perhaps bringing it in against Guardian, for example. But remember that it does cost 2, and it's going to be replacing one of these really crucial non-blood debt slots. And all of these slots are pretty tight, and all these cards are pretty important. And if you are replacing blood debt cards with Command and Conquer instead, just remember that does have some impact on your deck balance. So not that you should never do it, but just think carefully about it as well. Particularly in a match where you're being where your opponent's demanding that you go very wide, such as against Guardian, having Command and Conquer in your deck might actually be a hindrance rather than a help. Ninth Blade of the Blood Oath is one that's in there just for the Prism matchup, so it's just another 6+ attack that you can play. Eclipse Existence is there, so it only affects light heroes, so I'll pick this up because this is a bit of a out-of-the-box sideboard card that I'm playing. I found it to be really, really good. So it's 0 cost instant, pitches for 3. Whenever an attack you control hits a light hero this turn, you may banish a card from their soul. If you do, they lose 1. If you have more life than an opposing light hero, you may banish an action card from your graveyard. So basically, if you're on higher health than them, it says basically draw a card of your choice from your graveyard, which is amazing. It has to be an action, but most of the cards in your deck are actions. So you basically you're cycling this for any action of your choice from your graveyard. And also, whenever an attack you control hits a light hero this turn, you get to remove a card from their soul, and they lose a life. So that can just be massive at depriving those combo Boltyn decks of the cards in soul that they need to combo off, or depriving Prism of Spectral Shields that they've been setting up, and preventing those light heroes from playing their Celestial Cataclysms, which can deprive them of the ability to race you on key turns. So Eclipse Existence has been a real standout for me. Invert Existence is then the other sideboard slot. Now, this is fantastic against Boltyn, whether it's a Luminous Ascension combo deck or any other deck. The fact, any deck that plays attack actions, the ability to kill them on their turn from 4 or 6 life is just massive. It's particularly good against Boltyn because they tend not to play many arcane barriers, but on their combo turn, it's massive because they need their whole hand. So even if they have an arcane barrier, they can't afford to pitch for it. And after they play their Luminous Ascensions, you can play Invert Existence at instant speed and just kill them, which is just massive. So Invert Existence, a really, really important card. I love having 3 because, as I said, in those games where your opponent is playing non-attack actions, so it's usually going to be Guardian and Warrior, Boltyn, you can just let the Invert Existences sit there. If you banish one early, you just leave it, take a few damage from it, and then on their combo turn, when they play a couple of Luminous Ascensions, you just go bang, bang, Invert Existence, and kill them. And that can be huge. So I really like having that card in the sideboard. It's also a blue, and it has Blood Debt, and it can be played from the Banished Zone. So it's one that can come in and replace the blue Riftbinds or the blue Demigons. So that's pretty much the sideboard. In terms of things I'd take out, it is usually those blue Riftbinds and Demigons when I'm bringing in the Eclipse Existence, the Invert Existence, or their Time Snaps, because they're okay as blue subs, and it's okay to go down a little bit on Blood Debt numbers, because we are very high on Blood Debt density here. Plus the Invert Existence, if that's the one that's coming in, does actually have Blood Debt itself, so that's no concern. That can just be pretty much a straight swap. The equipment, we've got Dread Scythe and Nebula Blade. Nebula Blade for 99% of matchups. Dread Scythe really just for the Boltyn matchup. Because again, Dread Scythe, just like Eclipse Existence, can be quite disruptive to the Boltyn's game plan. It does cost 3 to attack, but whenever you attack with it, it deals an arcane damage to the defending hero, which helps with your Rip Through Realities. If they don't have arcane barriers, this is an easy way to just get an arcane damage trigger, though you have, of course, got seeds as well, so you should be fine for that. And whenever you attack with Dread Scythe, when a hero that's dealt damage by Dread Scythe, so that's either the arcane damage or its attack damage, which is 3, can't gain life during their next action phase. And that can really help against those Luminous Ascension combos where they rely not only on the sort of 30 odd damage that they're putting out in their combo turn to try and kill you, but they also rely on the life swing and the fact that gaining 2 or even 3 from each of their Centauri Saber hits usually puts them out of range of any backswing from you. Dread Scythe can prevent that from happening and mean that if they combo off when they're on sort of 4 or 5 life, if you can survive the hit, if you've had your life total high enough and you've been applying enough pressure to keep your life total above sort of 30 odd, or even 25 and block 5, for example, you can still combo off, you can survive the combo, and you can come back at them the next turn and hopefully kill them with a big turn, even if you've kept sort of 2 or 3 cards in hand. So Dread Scythe can be a good one against those Boltyn decks. Otherwise, we've got Crown of Dichotomy and Arcanite Skullcap. Crown of Dichotomy is a good Arcane Barrier equipment that also has another ability, so it's basically just better than having a Null Rune in your sideboard. Arcanite Skullcap, just a really efficient blocker, good against things like Katsu, but otherwise I'll generally think about playing Crown if I'm looking for a more aggressive start, just because the ability to put an attack, a Runeblade attack and a Runeblade non-attack from your graveyard on top of your deck can be quite nice in setting up a big turn. Grasp of the Arknight, just a really good, efficient 2 block battle-worn equipment that also has a relevant ability that you can use early in the game to pick up a rune chant, or really on any turn when you've just got spare resources and not enough to do with them. Having the ability to spend 2 to create a rune chant is just fantastic. Carrion Husk and either Ironweave are really interesting because Carrion Husk is amazing, very impactful, extremely powerful equipment. But at the same time, either Ironweave can get you the 2 resources that you need on a key turn to just have a bigger turn, and that can turn a loss into a win, obviously. 2 resources is quite a lot when you look at what that can mean in terms of what we can add to a turn. Either Ironweave, I'll generally play against any deck where I'm being asked, or where I think I'm going to be asked, to put out enough damage to kill them, where they're going to try and turtle and play a bit defensively. So I'll usually play this against Guardian. Although, and I'll come to this in a moment, I can see the argument for playing Husk in almost all these matchups. I'll usually play Ironweave against Bolton as well, and I'll usually play Ironweave against Prism. No, not true. I'll play Husk against Prism. So that's where the confusing part is. So even though Katsu and Prism have very defensive builds that can demand that you come over the top to win the game, I feel like this deck does do that anyway without the assistance from Ironweave. But where the deck struggles in those matchups, against those heroes, is against the aggressive Katsu decks that want to try and combo you out with combo lines, because they can actually kill you in the early game more quickly if you're not blocking, or if you're not blocking efficiently, or if you're not blocking really for sometimes up to 5 to 8 to 10 damage a turn, and disrupting their combos and disrupting their Mask of Momentums. So having the Carrion Husk can actually be the difference there. That can allow you to disrupt one key combo turn. So I'll usually play Husk against Katsu blind. I'll usually also play Husk against Prism blind, because it can block either a Herald of Judgment or a Herald of Erudition, which can be very important in preventing your opponent from pivoting and disrupting you in the case of Herald of Judgment. So Husk, I'll often play blind, and I'll play more often than not. Either Ironweave, though, I will play if I am pretty sure that it's going to be an aggressive mirror, or I'm going to be asked, or my opponent's playing control, and I'm definitely going to be asked to put out a lot of damage. And when I say aggressive mirror, I actually just mean Bolton. If it's an aggressive mirror, as I said, against Katsu or Prism, then I'm almost always playing Husk. Snapdragon Scalers, really, really important on one of those key turns to just give you a free action point. So we're not playing any other boots, because that can just be +1 action point when you've got 7 or 8 extra cards in hand. That's just massive. So that's been a rather long deck tech. I hope you've all enjoyed. If you've got any questions, please chime in the comments. In terms of budget options, this deck's actually quite a budget deck. You can absolutely drop the Skullcap, you can absolutely drop the Husk and just play Ironweave anyway in all the matchups, no problem. Then you've lost 2 of the legendaries. You can trade the Grasp of the Arknight for a Stubby Hammerers. Then you have no legendaries in your sideboard, in your equipment. So very cheap. Stubby Hammerers perfectly fine and makes your big turn even bigger. In terms of other cards, Command and Conquer really only for Prism. To be honest, you could just play any other 6 attack in its place and it would do functionally largely the same thing in this deck. You could just play 3 Ninth Blade and then a 4th being something else, or just play 3 Ninth Blade. Other expensive cards, Eclipse is the only other legendary. You can sub that out for, I'm playing a Cold Foil, but you can obviously play a Rainbow Foil. I think you can get Rainbow Foils these days for like about $70. So they're not hugely expensive. It's cheaper than 1 Command and Conquer. If you can't find Eclipse or you can't get it, that's fine. Just replace it with basically anything else. A 3rd copy of Blue Bounty Demigon or Riftbind. Just replace it with a blue. Art of War is the last one that's reasonably expensive. Very important for this deck. Try and get it. You can obviously, if you just remove the Art of War, you can totally play the deck without it. As I said, there are some games where you won't see an Art of War. That's just the way that the random banishes work. But the deck improves significantly if you have them. So do get them if you can. That's probably of the expensive cards, the most important one. And then I'd probably look at some of the equipment, maybe going Arknight, Grasp of the Arknight, Husk, then Skullcap, and then Command and Conquer's last. Cool. So I hope you've enjoyed. I hope that's useful. I've got some videos up of a slightly varied version of this deck, of me playing some gameplay of that. But I'll be hopefully putting up some games with this exact deck from another Armory event online tomorrow night. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you soon. Cheers.